More than 2 million beehives are being transported to California, not to produce honey, but to save a flowering season that could decide the fate of an almond industry worth more than $5 billion. Starting with bee boxes carefully prepared like a living army, then carried through the night on trucks to orchards entering their blooming season, the bees begin their pollination work across massive fields before later producing golden drops of honey inside industrial processing lines. So how can such a tiny insect help keep America's enormous harvests productive year after year? And what is pushing these little workers to the edge of exhaustion? Join Terran Works as we explore this in today's video. For decades, American agriculture has been known for its massive scale, heavy machinery, and an almost fully mechanized level of automation. Fields stretching across thousands of hectares can be planted with self-driving tractors, monitored by drones, irrigated through sensor systems, and harvested by industrial production lines running day and night. Yet, amid all of that technology, there is still one tiny task that machines have not been able to fully replace: transferring pollen from one flower to another. And it is at this fragile point that the bee, a small living creature, becomes a vital link in the chain. According to the USDA, more than 1/3 of U.S. crop production depends on insect pollination, with around 90 types of crops, from nuts and berries to flowering vegetables, requiring this process. Honeybees are considered the main pollinating force, contributing at least $15 billion each year by increasing crop yields and improving harvest quality. Almonds are the most striking example. Nearly all commercial almonds in the United States are grown in California, and the industry reached a value of more than $5 billion in 2021. Every February, when millions of almond trees burst into white blossoms at the same time, around 68% of all commercial honeybee colonies in the United States are brought to California specifically for this short pollination season. Before a bee colony can produce honey or serve pollination, everything begins with preparing the beehive boxes. From the outside, they may look like simple wooden boxes neatly arranged in an orchard or an apiary. But inside each hive is a miniature society, with a queen bee, worker bees, young bees, wax combs, stored honey, and tens of thousands of individuals operating together like a living body. During the peak growing season, a healthy colony can contain between 30,000 and 60,000 bees, and the strength of the entire colony depends almost entirely on the stability of the queen. Beekeepers usually place hive boxes in locations with abundant floral sources, close to clean water, well ventilated but protected from strong winds, free from flooding, and with limited exposure to pesticides. The hives are often raised above the ground to reduce moisture, keep away ants and rodents, and make it easier for beekeepers to inspect them. The direction of the hive entrance is also important. If it receives morning sunlight, the bees will become active earlier and fly out to collect nectar and pollen more efficiently. Inside the hive, the frames are arranged so the bees have enough space to build wax combs, raise larvae, and store honey. Beekeepers must make sure the colony is not too weak, not too crowded, and has enough food during periods when flowers are scarce. After the hive boxes have been placed securely, the beekeeper's most important task is to check the health of the entire colony. They open the hive lid, use a light puff of smoke to calm the bees, and then lift out each frame for inspection. To someone outside the industry, the golden brown wax frames may look almost the same. But to a beekeeper, each frame is a living report. Whether the queen is still laying eggs regularly, whether new eggs are present, whether the larvae are developing normally, whether there are enough worker bees, and how much honey and pollen remain in storage. If the colony is short on food, the beekeeper may add sugar syrup or pollen patties. If the colony is too weak, they may combine it with a stronger one. If the colony becomes too crowded, they have to split it to prevent the bees from flying away and forming a new nest. In many cases, an old or poor quality queen is also replaced with a new queen to maintain the reproductive strength of the entire colony. Caring for bees is a very special kind of work. Humans do not directly control each bee, but instead read the small signals inside the hive and intervene at the right moment. A strong colony can forage, raise larvae, build wax, and defend the hive on its own. But if it lacks food, becomes infected with disease, or loses its queen, the entire system can collapse very quickly. You know, one of the strangest migrations in American agriculture is not cattle or harvesters, but millions of beehive boxes loaded onto trucks. In late winter, when many regions are still cold, apiaries from across the United States begin stacking hives onto pallets, lifting them onto trailers with forklifts, covering them with protective netting, and transporting them through the night. Bees are usually transported at night because the temperature is cooler. Most of the bees have already returned to the hive, and the risk of them flying chaotically during the move is much lower. The most important destination is California. Every February, when the almond orchards of the Central Valley burst into white bloom at the same time, the demand for bees soars. Around 2 million beehives are brought here to serve a pollination season that lasts only a few weeks. And almonds alone can use up to about 68% of all commercial honeybee colonies in the United States. When the trucks arrive at the orchards, the pallets of bees are placed between the rows of trees by forklifts. Just a few hours later, as the sun rises and the temperature becomes warm enough, billions of bees begin flying out, spreading across the vast fields of blossoms. But this artificial migration is also controversial. Long-distance transport, climate changes, limited floral diversity, and exposure to many farming regions can put greater stress on bee colonies. So behind the brilliant almond bloom lies a difficult question. Is American agriculture relying on bees or pushing them to their limit? Pollination by bees is a very simple mechanism, but it plays a vital role in many harvests. When a bee lands on a flower, it is not actually working for humans. It is simply looking for nectar to get energy and pollen to feed the larvae inside the hive. But in that very moment, the bee's hairy body becomes a natural pollen transport machine. Tiny grains of pollen stick to the bee's legs, abdomen, and thorax. When it flies to the next flower, some of that pollen is transferred to the stigma, helping the plant become fertilized and begin producing fruit or seeds. The important thing is that this process has to happen at the right time. Almond, apple, blueberry, or pumpkin flowers do not stay open forever. The pollination window usually lasts only from a few days to a few weeks. If the weather is cold, rainy, or too windy, bees fly less. If the colony is weak, the number of flower visits drops. And if the flowers are not pollinated during that short period, farmers may lose yield before the growing season has truly even begun. A single honeybee can visit around 50 to 100 flowers in one flight, and a strong colony with tens of thousands of worker bees can create millions of flower visits during peak bloom. That is why bees do not only increase the fruit set rate, but also help fruit become more uniform, seeds develop better, and crop quality remain more stable. After their pollination flights, bees also create a product that is very familiar to humans: honey. The honey-making process begins with flowers. Worker bees use their proboscis to suck up nectar, store it in a special honey stomach, and then carry it back to the hive. There, the nectar is passed through several different worker bees, mixed with natural enzymes, and gradually changes its structure. At first, nectar can contain a large amount of water, but by constantly fanning their wings inside the hive, bees cause the moisture to evaporate, concentrating the honey until its moisture content usually drops to around 17 to 18%. When the honey is mature, the bees seal the honeycomb cells with a thin layer of wax to preserve it. Beekeepers only harvest when most of the frame has been capped, a sign that the honey has become thick enough and is less likely to ferment. The honey frames are removed from the hive, taken to the processing area, and then opened with a hot knife or an uncapping machine to remove the outer wax layer. After that, the frames are placed into a centrifugal extractor. As the machine spins, the honey is flung out of the wax cells, flows down into stainless steel tanks, and is filtered to remove bits of wax and natural impurities. After settling, the honey is bottled, labeled, and sent to the market. But in the modern beekeeping industry, honey creates an interesting paradox. For consumers, honey is the most famous product made by bees. But for American agriculture, the greater value often lies in pollination. In 2024, the value of pollination services in the United States was estimated at more than $400 million, higher than honey revenue at around $361.5 million. In other words, what we see on supermarket shelves is only one part of the story. The invisible value of bees is also found in every apple, every blueberry, and every almond formed thanks to their silent pollination flights. But behind the jars of golden honey and the successfully pollinated harvests, the American beekeeping industry is facing an enemy so small that it is extremely difficult to see with the naked eye. It is Varroa destructor, a reddish-brown parasitic mite, only about 1 to 2 millimeters in size, but considered one of the most dangerous threats to modern honeybees. Varroa does not attack a bee colony in a loud or obvious way. It silently clings to the bodies of adult bees, then slips into brood cells before worker bees cap them. Inside those cells, the female mites reproduce directly on the bodies of the developing young bees. They drain nutrients, weaken the bees, shorten their lifespan, and in many cases can cause adult bees to emerge with deformed wings. But what makes Varroa even more terrifying is that it is not just a parasite. It also acts like a virus carrier, spreading many dangerous pathogens throughout the hive. In a normal bee colony that can contain 30,000 to 60,000 individuals, this decline does not happen in a single day. At first, it may be only a few weakened bees, a few abnormal brood cells, or a few small warning signs on the frames. But as the Varroa population rises, the entire colony begins to lose strength. There are fewer worker bees, young bees develop poorly, foraging ability declines, and the hive struggles to survive the winter. In recent years, many reports have recorded that winter colony losses in the United States can reach very high levels, even exceeding 40 to 50% among some commercial beekeeping groups. This is creating new challenges for American agriculture. Precisely because Varroa, disease, and the pressure of constant transportation are wearing down the health of bee colonies, the future of American agriculture cannot rely only on bringing more hives into the fields. When honeybees help pollinate more than 90 types of commercial crops, and pollination services can generate tens of billions of dollars in value each year for U.S. agriculture, protecting bee colonies is no longer just a concern for beekeepers. It has become part of food security. One new direction is technology. Commercial apiaries are beginning to use sensors inside beehives to monitor temperature, humidity, hive weight, sound, and colony activity levels. Instead of relying only on experience when opening each frame, beekeepers can detect early signs that a colony is short on food, has lost its queen, is showing reduced flight activity, or is beginning to weaken. For farms stretching across thousands of hectares, this data helps distribute hives more accurately, especially during short pollination seasons such as California's almond bloom, where around 2 million hives can be brought into orchards in just a few weeks. But technology is not enough if the agricultural landscape remains too monotonous. In many industrial orchards, flowers bloom densely for a short period and then almost disappear. Bees may have an enormous food source for a few weeks, but after that, they can suffer from nutritional shortages. That is why many farms are beginning to plant cover crops, wildflowers, biological hedgerows, and strips of native plants to provide food for bees before and after the main bloom season. However, the debate still remains. Farmers need high yields, beekeepers need healthy colonies, and conservationists worry that commercial honeybees may compete with native bees. After years in which winter colony losses in the United States have frequently remained high, sometimes exceeding 40%, the question is no longer simply how to have more bees. The real question is, how can we build an agricultural system that does not exhaust the very creature keeping it alive? Even though many obstacles remain, from Varroa disease and the pressure of transportation to monoculture farming, bees still reveal one clear truth. Modern agriculture cannot rely on machinery alone. In a world where farms are becoming larger, data is becoming more important and the demand for food keeps rising, these tiny bee colonies continue to quietly turn flowers into fruit, seeds, and economic value for the United States. And perhaps in the future, modern agriculture will not only be measured by self-driving tractors or drones, but also by how humans protect the small creatures that keep this entire system running. The Sahara is often seen as a vast, motionless desert, frozen in place at the heart of Africa. In reality, it is a system in motion. Over the past century, the southern edge of the Sahara has steadily advanced into the Sahel, a region where people once farmed, grazed livestock, and built livelihoods across generations. Landscapes that once supported grasses and shrubs have gradually turned into bare, cracked surfaces, stripped of their ability to recover on their own. The most frightening element is not the sand itself, but the disappearance of the transitional ecological layers. As sparse vegetation vanishes, the soil loses its protective cover. Rainwater no longer infiltrates, and each rainy season washes away another fragment of the land's biological foundation. Desertification therefore does not unfold as a sudden dramatic collapse, but as a slow draining of life, until the ecosystem no longer has a foothold from which it can return to its previous state. In this context, the question is no longer how to green the Sahara, but what caused the lands along its margins to lose their capacity to sustain life in the first place. And as the ecological foundation begins to crumble, how do the roles of biological links, from plants to pollinators like bees, begin to change? On a global scale, bees are not just insects. They are part of the planet's ecological infrastructure. Roughly 1/3 of the food humans consume each day depends directly or indirectly on pollination by bees and similar species. From apples and almonds to melons, leafy vegetables, and even the plants that feed livestock, all are linked by those small but tireless flights. Bees do not create life, but they determine whether life can continue. When bees disappear, collapse does not arrive as a loud, dramatic catastrophe. It unfolds quietly, and often irreversibly. By contrast, when bees return, recovery is usually faster than people expect. Wildflowers can reappear within a single season. Seeds are dispersed farther. Isolated patches of green reconnect into continuous vegetation. For this reason, bees are often regarded as biological indicators. Where bees thrive, ecosystems are functioning properly. Even in harsh environments, this role does not change. In Nevada, one of the hottest and driest states in the United States, more than 1,000 bee species still survive across deserts and semi-arid landscapes. They pollinate native plants, maintain sparse but stable vegetation, and indirectly prevent the land from collapsing entirely into sand. When bee populations there began to decline in the early 2000s, it was not only honey that disappeared. The entire local ecosystem became more fragile. Nevada reveals a critical truth. Even at the edge of survivability, bees remain a force that keeps life from slipping out of balance. From this central role, a bold assumption begins to take shape. If bees can prevent harsh landscapes like Nevada or the Arava from collapsing completely, could they do more than that? Could bees become the spark that restarts life in places that are almost entirely dead? In the scenario being discussed, bees are not seen as a complete solution, but as a catalyst. Queen bees are collected from other regions, kept cold to slow their metabolism, then transported across seas, across sand, and deep into the Sahara. The goal is not to turn the desert into grassland within a few years, but to trigger an ecological chain reaction, giving plants a chance to reproduce, preventing young vegetation from remaining isolated, and creating the first biological footholds for soil recovery. Examples from around the world make this assumption less far-fetched. In Israel's Arava Desert, bees have not only survived but become a foundation of modern desert agriculture. Amid dry, rocky terrain, beehives are placed directly in the fields. They pollinate crops, significantly increase yields, and transform areas once considered uncultivable into major sources of agricultural production. In this case, bees do not green the desert, but they allow humans to extract the maximum potential from what the desert can support. This is what turns the Sahara into the next question: larger, harsher, and far more dangerous. However, the Sahara is neither Nevada nor the Arava. It is a place where biological limits are pushed to the extreme. Bees can adapt to heat, but not to infinite heat. The ideal temperature inside a beehive is around 35 degrees Celsius. When the surrounding environment exceeds that threshold, the entire colony must work relentlessly just to survive, flying to create airflow, carrying water back to the hive, beating their wings like living fans. All of this consumes enormous amounts of energy and only works when extreme heat eventually subsides. In the Sahara, the heat does not retreat. Sand temperatures can exceed 70 degrees Celsius. The air holds almost no moisture, and the most dangerous factor is not the heat itself, but its persistence. Even in Nevada, where groundwater and vegetation still exist, researchers have documented beehives melting during prolonged heat waves. The wax softens, the structure collapses, and colonies are forced to abandon their nests. If this can happen in an ecosystem that is still functioning, then in the Sahara, where there is almost no biological foundation to rely on, the risk is exponentially greater. Even the most heat-tolerant species, such as East African bees or Nubian bees, cannot survive on bare sand alone. Ancient bee colonies discovered near the Kufra oases show that life has persisted in the Sahara for thousands of years, but only where there was water, vegetation, and soil capable of retaining moisture. Bees do not create these conditions. They do not generate water. They do not turn sand into soil, and they cannot rescue an ecosystem that has already collapsed at its foundation. So when we confront the Sahara directly, the limits of bees become unmistakably clear. Bees may return, but only after the land has been prepared in advance. And that raises another question, more practical and perhaps more important. If bees cannot be the starting point, then who or what is quietly repairing the soil and water of the Sahara, giving life a chance to return? For this reason, the Sahara does not need more bees at this moment. It needs something more fundamental: soil that can hold water, and water that can remain long enough for life to restart from the ground up. Bees do not create these conditions. They only return once such conditions already exist. And it is precisely along the southern edge of the Sahara, where the desert meets the Sahel, that humans have chosen a different approach. Not beginning with animals, not beginning with plants, but beginning by repairing the land itself. From that choice emerged a project known as Africa's Great Green Wall. The Sahara Desert currently covers about 9.2 million square kilometers, nearly the size of the United States, and accounts for almost 1/3 of the African continent. More alarming, however, is the fact that it is still expanding. As the Sahara advances, the Sahel does not disappear overnight, but it gradually loses its ability to sustain human life. The paradox is that the Sahel is not a land without rain. Each year, the region still experiences short but intense rainy seasons. The problem lies elsewhere. The soil has lost its capacity to absorb water. After decades of overexploitation, heavy grazing, and prolonged drought, the land surface has become compacted and sealed, hardening almost like cement. When rain falls, water no longer infiltrates the soil but instead rushes across the surface, causing flash floods before vanishing entirely. The result is a deadly vicious cycle. Drought weakens the soil, heavy rains accelerate erosion, fertile topsoil is washed away, and with each passing rainy season, the land becomes even less capable of retaining water. Desertification, therefore, is not merely a climate issue. It is the collapse of the entire soil-water system that once sustained life along the edge of the Sahara. And from this realization, the Great Green Wall did not begin with planting trees, but with a different question altogether: how to make water stay before speaking of any form of life returning. For decades, humanity's first reflex in the face of desertification has always been to plant trees. Billions of saplings have been introduced into the Sahel through large-scale campaigns, backed by billions of dollars in international aid. Yet the outcome in most places has been tragically similar: mass die-offs after just 1 or 2 rainy seasons. The problem was not a lack of effort, but a mistake in sequence. Young trees were planted into soil that had already lost its structure, was nearly devoid of living microorganisms, and had no capacity to retain water. When rain arrived, water ran off too quickly. When the sun returned, surface temperatures soared, and moisture evaporated within hours. Under such conditions, roots never had a chance to grow deep enough to survive. Planting trees on dead soil is like installing a sophisticated machine on a collapsed foundation. The Sahel's problem is not a shortage of greenery, but the loss of soil's ability to sustain life. And if the foundation is not repaired first, every effort above it can only ever be temporary. It was from these repeated failures that in 2007, the African Union launched an initiative known as the Great Green Wall. The project stretches roughly 8,000 kilometers across the Sahel Belt, from the Atlantic coast in the west to the Red Sea in the east, involving more than 20 countries. However, contrary to popular imagination, this is not a continuous wall of trees running across the continent. In reality, the Great Green Wall is a mosaic-like network of ecosystem restoration efforts. Each region applies different solutions, tailored to local soil conditions, water availability, and the livelihoods of surrounding communities. The core philosophy of the project is clear. It does not force the desert to turn green, but repairs the way soil and water function. Once the land regains its ability to retain water, life can return on its own, following the natural sequence. Trees are not the starting point. They are the final outcome of a system that has been restored correctly.